Hey everyone, it's Edd Bazaar here from Live Guitar Solos, and we have a very special guest. Every guest we have is special, but in particular, this we have Nicolay, um, wonderful artist, originally from the Netherlands. He's a hip hop artist, a member of the Foreign Exchange. Yeah, how you doing?
I'm doing good, man. Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure and an honor.
Thank you. Likewise, very much so. So you're from originally the Netherlands, right? I mean, it's been well documented your history with the Foreign Exchange with Phonte and how you guys met up and created your first album together, connected practically overseas. Long distance at a time where the internet was pretty much new, wasn't it? So early 2000s. So, but we will get to that. But you're from the Netherlands. I'm from Australia, as you know. You must have had a healthy dose of American music growing up. Would that be correct?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that in the Netherlands is a fairly USA focused country when it comes to culture. So, for instance, I grew up on largely American TV shows and movies, and certainly music. Yeah, like my first sort of recollections of interacting with music was actually through my mother's record collection. As a little boy, I really liked the vinyl format as a physical thing, as a thing to touch, and explore. Covers, like this was before I would really kind of know what I was listening to per se, but I really remember liking looking at the records. And so some of the earliest music that I really loved was Stevie Wonder, um, Nina Simone, but also like Neil Young, the band. My mother has a very eclectic music taste that ranges from kind of the typical, a lot of her taste dates back to the 70s. So that was my first foray into music. So yeah, I've always listened to, I think, predominantly American, and I would even say black genres. The first artist that I feel was really my own artist was Prince, who obviously had a massive impact and influence on my life, both personally as well as musically. Um, it was by way of Prince that I started really listening to other funk and soul artists, both new as well as kind of his influences that he would, talk about. And that in itself led me to hip hop, in the early 90s, which in itself unlocked like things like jazz for me. So yeah, I've always particularly been into music genres that I suppose are inherently American, and more specifically Afro-American, if you will.
Yeah, and I'm the same. So I mean, that's the thing. So I mean, we're talking about, I mean, I was listening to my parents' music when I was young, so I have memories of being maybe 5 years old at the first place I lived in, listening to vinyls, like my ear against the speaker, trying to dissect what I'm listening to, the melodies. Like how old were you? Like how young were you when you began to sort of be triggered by, oh, music is, I enjoy this stuff. So and with Stevie Wonder and all that.
I would
When
have
did
been I would have been literally the same age. I think I was 4 or 5. Like I remember that we moved to the house that I pretty much ended up coming of age in 1979. I was born in 74, and so my earliest music memories kind of date back to, I think, late 70s, early 80s. I would have been 5 years old. I remember there was one particular record that I've actually spoken about a lot, which is Journey Through the Secret Life of Plants by Stevie Wonder, which was the album that came after Songs in the Key of Life, and was largely considered a flop by both critics as well as like his fan base. But for me, it was my entry point into Stevie, so I didn't know any better. And I remember being particularly fascinated by a couple of things. The braille on the cover, like that was fascinating to me. I'd never felt braille before, and I understood through my mother that Stevie Wonder was actually blind, and that made it very interesting to me. Like somebody who's not able to see, making an entire album about nature, like that was very, that was fascinating to me as a kid. And then another thing that really jumped out was his use of synthesizers, like the sounds that he was pioneering really, really spoke to me as a kid. And I think later on, of course, were very formative in my own sort of pioneering in terms of sounds and synth sounds. But yeah, I must have been 5, 6 years old. Really like a lot of different stuff. I even like classical music a lot. My mom would play some classical music at the time. And I was just really, I think more than music, I was fascinated by sound. I think that's where it started. Before I could say like, oh, this is rock, or this is a guitar, or this is, a keyboard, or this is a violin. I was very much into sound. And I think that was my entryway into later kind of getting a fuller understanding of how music works. But it was definitely vinyl. I don't think that was a coincidence. I think now, looking back, vinyl, I think in particular, was a format that invited listening to music as an activity versus just having a phone and having it all in Spotify. And people had music collections. Those music collections would say something about who you were as a person. And then the tangible item that was a vinyl record, and being able to grab it and feel it and touch it and study it. I think all of those elements were very crucial for me as an early fan. And I didn't really have that later with, for instance, CDs. Like I think that vinyl as a kid was something really interesting to me. And my mother didn't have a huge record collection, but it was enough for me to really be fascinated with it early on in my life, for sure.
Mm. Yeah, I could totally sort of relate to that myself. My dad was also a big influence on me. I'm not like with the music as well, because he had his own vinyls, which was the whole metal, 80s, 70s, 80s metal, rock and roll, um, blues. He came up from that, it's like Santana and all that kind of stuff. So it was just this overall view of things. Was your dad sort of an influence on you with the music, or was he not into music at all?
Not really. I mean, he's more like he's one of those people that he likes everything, quote unquote. But he like my mother was the one that was like more deliberate in like the things that they had in the house. Like my dad is somebody who just likes what he hears. Like I remember my dad liking stuff like ABBA and stuff, which I'm not saying anything bad about it, because of course, like now that I know more about music, I know that that's very much something that is in itself on the surface kind of like pop material, but when you start really digging into it, very sophisticated in terms of writing and production and recording techniques. But I didn't know that really at the time, but my dad liked ABBA. So like he liked really kind of just music that would make him feel good, but he wasn't really somebody that had a lot of his own kind of favorite artists. Like my mother was the one that really had, records by, like I remember Abbey Road by the Beatles. That was one that she loved. So it's interesting how my personal connection to a lot of artists was actually really kind of shaped by the particular record that my mother would have, which may not have been the best record in their catalog at all, but that was randomly like, there's a Neil Young record that I love called Comes a Time, which is from the late 70s, and everybody, of course, had Harvest. But I So same with the Stevie record. These were just randomly the records that my mother had, and so those are the records that I just looking back, like have these memories tied into it, attached to it. Like Abbey Road was one that I would play over and over and over. And I particularly remember liking the side B, where it's the medley of songs and they're all kind of, you know, tied into each other. And again, just a lot of really fascinating sounds, right? So I was early on, I think, perhaps destined to become a music producer, because I really loved sounds. Like I really loved sort of the creativity behind you know, sound, and later, of course, I started figuring out like how to achieve these type of things. But as a kid, I was just really into sound. So yeah, it was my mother's record collection, and my dad was he was just sort of going along with it. He's more like a pop guy. Like he likes what he likes, and I'm sure he'll have his favorites, but not in a way that it was really kind of directly influential on me the way my mother was.
But well, in terms of the Beatles, I mean, because I spent a lot of time with my grandparents, you know, every second weekend or so. So on my mum's side, that is, my dad's side is different, but they loved ABBA. Same deal. My parents loved ABBA. They always played it. I mean, so I really grew an appreciation for their sense of melody, and I mean, obviously the pop for their time, but just their transition from when they began to disco even, and they became funky. I mean, it was seamless because they were real artists, you know. They made their own music, you know. And I grew an appreciation for all of that through both of my parents as well. So like similar to you. So I mean, that was just how things were back then in a lot of ways, wasn't it?
Yeah, I think even the pop music back then had a sophistication that is kind of hard to imagine in 2024. But I grew up on ABBA because one, it was on the radio all the time, you know, and like you said, the melodies, and then I not too long ago, and when I say not too long ago, it probably is years at this point, but I read the definitive ABBA biography, really learned a lot about even the business side of like how they were sort of doing things. And of course, Sweden now is kind of considered to be sort of the nirvana of pop music in general. But just how they wrote, the fact that they would record, they would sort of double a lot of parts. Like, so they would have a piano part and they would essentially do everything twice. So it got this really big chorusy sort of sound. And you know, those guys knew what they were doing. And when you start studying, like even like stuff like Dancing Queen, like you said, when it was getting more kind of, you know, like that's not there's a lot of content in that music, even though it was written and recorded to be appealing to the masses, quote unquote. It has a lot of musical content in it that even if you're a more of a discerning listener or a connoisseur, like I really became very, very much a fan of Björn and Benny, just because of the pioneering work that they were doing in writing and recording, producing their own recordings, and just realizing that in the 70s and the 80s, like pop music still had a sort of a base of real solid musical content. And even when I started later growing up, even when you listen to, you know, I was very big on the English wave of bands like Spandau Ballet and Duran Duran and Talk Talk and stuff like that. And even that was still an era. I would say even like a group like Wham, that was still an era when these songs were written and produced in order to really kind of reach a mainstream audience, but they had a kernel of real musical content in them that I think find lacking in the pop music of today, you know.
Well, because you mentioned that, like, first of all, like with the ABBA thing, I mean, you know, like you said, Dancing Queen. I mean, the chord progressions is like genius with the melody. Like, it's just that's what makes you feel something. It makes you want to dance, not only because of the groove, the beat, but like it's the it makes it can make you want to cry, sort of thing. You know what I mean? Kind of moment. That was
Yeah,
it. Well, their genius was, rather than just four on the floor, disco. They had a bit more, but then they could do the four on the floor style with Voulez-Vous. I mean, that's my favorite ABBA song, to be honest.
that's an amazing song because the meter of it is really different. Like it's not it, they switch between 6 and 4 kind of sometimes in the phrasing. Yeah, I mean they really I think again, like when I listened to it at the time as a kid, I just thought it sounded great and it made me feel really good. But later on, I started sort of realizing, like, wow, this stuff is very sophisticated. The recording and the production of it, which of course for me as a music producer, I became fascinated by later in life, and realizing that the chord changes, the changes in meter and even tempo sometimes, like these were little symphonies almost, and at the same time, they were able to package it in a way that like everybody would love it, So in my own way, that taught me that it's okay to make music that is accessible, that you don't necessarily have to be, that music can be. Another great example is Return to Forever, the jazz group, Chick Corea. Like I would always really love that Chick stuff was both very jazzy and legit in terms of the content, but his goal primarily with to Forever was to make music that was accessible, that wasn't highbrow or difficult, quote unquote, but that could sort of make a bridge, right, between serious kind of jazz heads, but also just regular people. And so I've always had a real affinity for music that sounded good, that was accessible. Prince, I think, is another example where he had definitely had, a part of him that was experimental and trying to push the envelope. But at the end of the day, the music was accessible, yet it still had the legitimacy of somebody who's trying to move genres forward, So I think when I look at my music, like especially when I began making music sort of around the time of Connected, like I wanted to make music that was beautiful. I wanted to make music that a lot of people would like, that didn't have any uh speed bumps in terms of like how people would be able to get into it. And I think that's still true to this day, that I like making music that potentially a lot of people can like. When my parents like some of my music, I normally know, like, okay, like that means I've sort of, done something that is universal enough that people who are now in their 70s, that they sort of hear something in it that they like, you know what I mean?
Mm, absolutely, and and then he's and what your approach to your music is not just and also back in the day, pop music wasn't just cookie cutter bubblegum pop. Like would you have a lot of in these days? There's some great stuff, but same chord progression, same vocal melodies, and in with several artists. I'm like, really? I mean, this is a new artist, and they're singing the same vocal lines. Like, is this just a producer, or is this them? Is this just what's popular? Like, it sounds the same to me. Back then, everything was different. Like, you had a certain characteristic with every artist, like Prince, like you said, even George Michael. I mean, he to me is one of the goats. He's one of the pop goats. I mean,
Oh man,
with MJ and Prince, man, like he had
I could talk about George Michael for hours, bro. Like I'm like
so
that man, like
sole
yeah,
credit, like for 6 US number ones. Sole credit.
yeah,
He wasn't just
yeah.
some guy just standing up and wake me up. Like, nah, it was more than
No,
that.
no, no.
Actual
I
talented
remember,
individual.
like I was a big Wham fan. Like this was kind of before I got into Prince, but like when I was in my early teens, like Wham was everywhere. And Yeah, at first it was like, oh, there's two pretty guys, they look really great, and they, make this music that just, but the same goes for Wham. Like once you start analyzing it, like a song, like I realize this is a George Michael solo, but I was fascinated by Careless Whisper, um, because it was so sophisticated. And then in the recent Wham documentary, which I don't know if you've seen it, but you should watch it because it's absolutely incredible. But we learned that he was 17 when he wrote Careless Whisper. And when you analyze those lyrics, like guilty feet have got no rhythm, you just are like, how does a 17-year-old come up with that type of sophistication? And then he had the wherewithal to ultimately decide that only he could produce that recording in a way that it would be the definitive version, right? So at some point he started producing his own material, writing his own material, and then you just realize like this man is a genius, and again, somebody who is able to make hits, quote unquote. Which I mean, I think nowadays we use the term hits, and it's kind of almost a derogatory term. But back in the day, like a hit was you were sort of searching out the hit, but you were doing it with music that was still, again, still had a legitimacy. You know what I mean? So a lot of these records from the 80s, like again, Duran Duran, you know, were designed to be hits, but somehow still had that musical content that really kind of held it up, and right now I think it's largely because of the advance of music technology, plugins and laptops, and it's accessible to everybody right now. You no longer need to be in a studio. You no longer need to deal with engineers. You can do what you want. The upside of that is like that truly brilliant people nowadays have very little to no difficulty in being able to express their ideas. However, I think it also, the flip side of it, that it has dumbed down a lot of stuff. When you listen to pop music nowadays, there are no bridges, there are no modulations out of the main key. There is, and I ultimately don't want to seem judgmental, because these things kind of go in cycles, and I never want to be sort of the old guy that is lamenting, oh, it used to be better back in the day. Although, secretly, I think I do feel that way. But there's something in every generation, and I'm still able to appreciate a lot of pop music nowadays. But I'm missing certain things that were really prevalent when we were growing up. And people were, there was a pre-chorus and a chorus, and it would modulate to the relative minor, or, like it would just have a lot of stuff that would, make it a full composition. I think nowadays when you hear a song, it's usually beat related, right? It may not change from the main key or the main kind of chord progression. It seems like it has a lot to do with, I think, the attention span that people have nowadays. And of course the fact that we all now have all of the music that was ever recorded in our phones. And so does it still mean the same in lives of people nowadays? I would argue that it doesn't. I would argue that when I was in high school, music listening was an activity. Like we would get together Friday afternoons. If something new came out, that was the activity. We would listen to it, we would discuss it, we would, compare it to previous works that we liked, and that was an activity. And I think nowadays people listen to music, driving to work or cleaning the house, but I rarely hear people sitting down and listening to music deliberately, and that's just a sign of the times. I think technology has advanced to a point where and this is probably a tangent that I'll at some point just stop me, but I feel the same about TV and movies. Like we have everything now, and as a result, I think it all means less than it did when I remember, you know, you had to stay home for stuff. You know, you had to kind of, you know, you had 3 TV channels, and what was on it was what you were going to get. You know, now we have the evolution of technology has gone so far that we have everything that our hearts would desire, and at the same time, it leaves us sort of unfulfilled. You know, in current day.
Yeah, look, I agree to a certain extent. I wouldn't say this is as much as like uh, you know, being the old guy, you know, quote unquote, but it's more to do with a contrast between the realities back then to what we have today. So it's just the difference. We're just talking about the difference between, because there are artists these days. I mean, you know, anything that Pharrell Williams does or Timbaland does, I respect. You know, for example, in the pop world, or you know, because there's musicality, there's musicianship, they're producers, they got, you know, the or Dark Child as well. Um, but then looking at Dua Lipa or Bruno Mars, I mean, also all the guys, James Fontelroy, I think his name is. So I mean, he's old school. I mean, he's won Grammys for what he's done, like, with Justin Timberlake as well. So, I mean, that's there's an element of that old school vibe, and these guys, these producers are like our age, sort of thing, you know. From so it seems authentic in a sense, which is good. But then we're talking about everything's like, oh, we're going through 80s phases, we're going through 90s, now we're going through like 2000s, like fashion as well. Are we just not original anymore? Or do we want to just keep looking at the past and not
Right.
pave the way for new stuff? It's
Yeah,
a bit
which is, I think is also partly the industry is to blame. But like right now, like I feel like a lot of music is derivative in the sense that it's either using particularly a particular song. Like the other day, I was listening to something and it was new, but it was also like it was like a police song. It was very much like, okay, they are doing this, and it completely new lyrics and vocals, but based on an existing idea. And I think partly to blame is the music industry that at some point started looking at things like what is the easiest sell, right? Like what is the easiest to sell, and that kind of traces back to how, you know, I mean, it might be a controversial name to bring up right now, but like how Diddy, when he first started really looping these records, like, right, like a Sting record or like a, you know, like not necessarily doing a lot of creative work with it, but essentially just taking loops. You know, I think the industry saw that and realized that, okay, that's an easier sell. People already know these records, so there's something that you can build on, and that's safer than a completely new record. Also, I think the further you go in time, the harder it is to be original, right? I mean, when you look at the '60s, you know, there was a lot of new ground being covered. The '70s, the '80s, the '90s, but at some point, you know, all these notes have been used, right? All these chords have been used. So I think there's almost no escape into the fact that at some point works are going to get more and more derivative. I do think there's still a lot that you can do. Even like I would argue that our music is derivative to a large extent, in the sense that it is standing on the shoulders of those that came before us. Um, so I'm really not using that as a diss. I just think that the further you go in time, the harder it is to come up with something that is truly new. You know, and over a course of history, it still happens. I would argue that, for instance, D'Angelo, when he came out, that was truly a new, you know, yes, he was building on Prince and he was building on, you know, soul, and but there, Timberland, who you mentioned earlier, when he was coming on the scene with the first Missy Elliott album and the Genuine and stuff like that, and that Aaliyah record, One in a Million, like that was truly a new, like, yes, he was building on hip hop, but when you started hearing those beats and the way that a lot of those things were double timed and he was sort of beatboxing a lot of it, that was truly new, you know. So I do still think that you'll see people pop up that kind of create like truly personal styles, like how Prince had a style that really was like no one who came before him, even though he was in the 80s realm. Like when you listen to all the other 80s records that were trying to emulate him, they don't quite have that je ne sais quoi. They're lacking that sort of kind of one thing that made his stuff kind of stand, you know, stand above everybody else. So I think it will still happen. I really like right now. I really like an artist. His name is Gareth Duncan. I want to say he's a really incredible. I think he's from the UK, and he's got like a little bit of a Michael Jackson kind of feel to his stuff, but incredible music, like really great production, amazing vocal arrangements. Like, so I think even young people will ultimately start looking at some of these people that came before them and appreciate and want to emulate some of these techniques, you know, and realize what all is possible, right? So I really am not decrying a lot of these things. I just think that, you know, as we go on, it might be there might be far and few in between, but they're still out there. There's still people that make incredible music. You have to do your best to find them, though. You know, it's not always stuff that gets pushed to the forefront by on the radio, for instance, but there's still people making incredible music.
So that's pretty much how we grew up listening to music, and the comparison to what's here now. There's advantages and disadvantages. Music is music at the end of the day, and but going back to your influences, so you mentioned Stevie Wonder. So obviously, Secret Life of Plants, and I mean, I obviously there's elements of that album that's in your music today, for sure, without a doubt. The whole esoteric, sort of spaced out, well, not really spaced out, but it's just he created it was atmospheric sort of. How can you explain it? Like I mean, about planet Earth and all this kind of stuff. He really, which, you know, as a pop artist, was really left of center for him, and which is what you said. It was the reason why it was such a flop in the eyes of, you know, people expecting him to bring up just another pop album. But
Yeah.
and Stevie, so the synthesizers. So, and I mean, I love Stevie obviously because my mum had Hotter Than July, so she had the only album that she had of his, and I used to listen. I said, man, this his voice was just, and then I'd see he's on Off the Wall. He wrote I Can't Help It, and I was like, oh, this guy's everywhere. And then just learning the history, and then eventually hearing his use of synths with the synclavier and with the trying to use it as a guitar. As a guitarist, I'm like, wow. With have you heard of What's That You're Doing with Paul McCartney?
Mm-hmm.
It's like a guitar, and I'm like, he's doing guitar solos with, and it's all on the keyboards. My personal favorite Stevie album is In Square Circle. Obviously,
Nice.
It's crazy, but so tell me what was it about Stevie that for you was like, okay, this is what I want to do with my life?
Yeah, I think that's a very that's a tenfold answer, if you will. But like I think so. Looking back, it was the sound that drew me in, and he was using on Secret Life of Plants. But later, I kind of traced back and went to Songs in the Key of Life, Talking Book, like just kind of the whole stretch. But the first thing that really struck me was the use of the which later I found out was the Yamaha CS80, which that's all over Secret Life of Plants. And I think he was a pioneer. Like, and I don't want to seem insensitive or otherwise, but I think because Stevie was blind, he was such a pioneer in creating new sounds. Like, he wouldn't just, you know, he would program these synthesizers. He would you know, he would really take them to levels that I think even the creators of these instruments didn't know were possible. You know, so when you listen to Secret Life of Plans, it opens up with an instrumental, and it's actually a tritone. It's a don 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 don, and it's really a very unconventional way to start a record when you've just sold millions of, you know, a record that had like Pastime Paradise, as like all these hits, you know, and but then the second thing I would say is that album has some amazing songwriting. Come Back as a Flower, Black Orchid, just so the melodies that Stevie would use, the chord progressions, the sound of his voice, the way that he kind of would, you know, you've said, like you rightfully pointed out, that he would write a lot for others, but I would still argue that Stevie at his best would be the executor, like his own, the singer of his own songs, because of the fluid way that he would voice and phrase these melodies. You know, I remember, you know, even something very kind of on its surface simple, like "Don't You Worry About a Thing," where he goes and he goes all the way down and he goes back up and does it again. Like, to me, I was just like, what the hell is this? Like, how is this so, like, how is it so fluid? And yet musically it makes sense, right? It's just a kind of a fall down the stairs, but in the best possible way. And he has a lot of those where he just kind of goes down a scale, like it can be fifths or fourths or whatever, but he kind of ties it all together. The production of it, you know, like his use of the clavinet, which kind of, you were mentioning guitar, but he would, you know, use these clavinets kind of almost like guitar parts. If you listen to Living Just Enough for the City or Superstition, incredibly funky clavinet parts that in many ways kind of mimic, you know, funk guitar arrangements. So, man, what is not to like about Stevie, you know? So for me as a kid, especially once I got into Prince and I realized how Prince was in his own way standing on the shoulders of people like Stevie, of people like Sly Stone, Marvin Gaye, you just kind of realize how it's not like how it's one continuous line over the years, right? George Clinton is another huge favorite of mine, P-Funk, Parliament Funkadelic. And you just realize you see a lot of that coming back into an artist like Prince, and then later an artist like D'Angelo. So for me, I'm always fascinated by the patterns and how influences can start. You know, as a young artist, you begin sort of by mimic your influences, right? Maybe even copying them. And at some point, you start to find your own voice. So I've always been very fascinated how these things kind of go in cycles. Certainly for myself, who, you know, once I got into Prince and then realized his influences, so Stevie, Sly Stone, George Clinton, James Brown, certainly, you know, I was letting that all come back into my music. So I think it's a really interesting thing how, you know, and they of course were all building on people like Ray Charles, or, you know, so I'm just a student of music in that sense. And of course I didn't know this when I was listening to Stevie Wonder as a 5-year-old, but I did know what I liked. I did know that this is something that appeals to me on a very base, on a very kind of natural level, where I just loved the sound of it. Nina Simone was another record that I loved. Like, it was a live album, and you know, at the time I didn't really know all the layers, like how Nina Simone was a very complex person, incredibly talented, also kind of discarded in many ways by American society at the time, like moving to Europe, in many ways similar as to how Marvin Gaye had at some point left America for Europe, and even Miles Davis had done that at some point. But these were really things that as a kid I didn't really know, but just was drawn into the sound of Nina Simone's voice and then her piano playing, you know. And I'm a big fan of any keyboard instrument, but certainly the piano. And so Nina Simone was another record. My mother had randomly had some records by Joan Armatrading, which is not an artist that you hear a lot about per se, but she was an incredible, I would say, album artist, like somebody that was really good at, you know, creating a body of work, a set of songs. So yeah, man, I have these very, very vivid memories of things that just randomly were part of this collection, and I would just pull them out, listen to them, and kind of gravitated towards the stuff like Beatles, the band. I was a very big fan of the Last Waltz album, that live album. Then I kind of moved my way back, music from Big Pink, Cahoots, like all of those records. My mother was a big Gordon Lightfoot fan, so I'm like all over the place, you know what I mean? But I think what all sort of bounded together was songwriting. You know, I think these were all people that were incredible writers. Leonard Cohen is another one that I discovered through my mother. Amazing lyricist, amazing songwriter. And what I liked about Leonard Cohen was that his voice didn't necessarily sound pretty at all. You know, and Bob Dylan was another artist that my mother liked. And I'm like, wait, these guys, like, they don't sound like Stevie Wonder, obviously. They're not, you know, they certainly are not as but even that, like, again, was a certain sound, a different time, a different kind of timbre, I guess, that I was interested in, like somebody who employs their voice in a totally different way, not smooth per se, not even schooled, but very appealing in a different way, you know. So I've always learned to listen to music. You mentioned metal. When I was in high school, I became really fascinated by stuff like Metallica and Slayer, and you know, because even though for a superficial listener that is like aggressive and confrontational, I like the melodies. I like the fact that these guys were technically super proficient. You know, the solos were incredible. It was all about sort of more kind of an acrobatic level of musicianship. So I've always been able to kind of appreciate something in truly everything, like truly any type of music. If I can connect to a particular element of it, I'll like it. I'll love it. I want to learn how it works. Like I was you know, since we're talking about live guitar solos, I was a big Kirk Hammett fan. Like I was just so incredible. Like those solos, man, they were like when we were in high school, you know, the sheer speed of it, the melodies, the tapping, like that to us was really, really, really kind of next level stuff. You know, I'm a big fan of Prince, the guitar player, specifically. I'm a big Frank Zappa fan. Steve Vai and Frank Zappa, and kind of how that whole world of the Frank Zappa universe. So even though I'm not a guitarist myself, I dabble a little bit, but I've always been a huge fan of guitar players, especially the ones that were more kind of on the creative side of things. You know, Yngwie G. Malmsteen was somebody that I really, really loved when I was growing up. Even Joe Satriani was, you know, these are all guys that I was like, whoa, something else is going on here. So yeah, as you can see, I've always liked a little bit of literally everything.
Mm. Yeah, and I have to say I'm very much the same in many ways. You know, and like Toto was a huge influence on me. Like, because like my dad had the Toto albums, but my mom had all the Quincy Jones stuff. And then I'd sit, you know, you'd read all the liner notes and say, these guys are over here, and these
guys, right?
What the hell is going on? And my mind was exploded. It was just I just want to hear everything now, because these guys can literally do everything. You know, every sound, the funk, the rock, they went heavier towards like now even, but I mean, just true absolute pros. You know, David Page and all these guys are
Oh
everywhere.
man,
You know, like
come on.
Steve Lukather and Picaro brothers and all these other stuff. They're
Yeah,
influential, but
yeah,
sort of underrated in a lot of ways as well. But I know in Europe they're huge.
yeah.
Toto.
Yeah, they were really, really big with. So when I was in high school, like I'll be very honest with you. Like you had two groups. You had the kids that loved Toto and Pink Floyd and stuff like that, and then you had the group that liked Metallica and Slayer and Megadeth and Sepultura. And we kind of at the time we were kind of laughing a little bit about Toto. We thought that was soft, and it wasn't later that I realized like, oh my God, like it's just the songwriting, the arrangements, the Porcaro brothers like Dave Page and Steve Porcaro, their interplay on keyboards, and then like you said, realizing they were involved with Thriller and just wrote Human Nature, and that was one of my all-time favorite like Michael songs, and then how they even got like to realize that Human Nature was on the back of a tape, and it was kind of a coincidence that Quincy even heard it, when he was looking for that last sort of song that would bring Thriller together. But that fascinates me about music, right? That these things there's an interplay there where it's just like, Toto was its own group, but they were doing all these session things and hugely influential in the LA session scene, and realizing that it all kind of plays together, that it doesn't even really matter what genre it is or what style it is, but that there's this sort of symbiosis of stuff. And when you later get into music and you appreciate it with a more analytical mind, just realize like, wow, like a song like Rosanna, like I can listen to that a million times and you're still hearing new things, and of course Jeff Porcaro was an incredible drummer, and so yeah, Toto was initially something that we were like, oh, this is a little soft, but Steve Lukather is an amazing guitar player, of course, and they were all amazing writers, and when you get into music yourself, at some point you realize like, oh wow, the writing part, that's kind of what separates the men from the boys, right? Like that, you don't know that at first, but you're like, okay, they write their own stuff, they write for others. I'm a fan and a student of songwriting. Stevie, of course, going back to all the way to the Beatles, Prince, like at some point you realize like, okay, like it's one thing if you're an amazing talent at a voice or an instrument, but once these people are starting to write material, that's kind of that's the cutting edge of it, right? And so that's when I started realizing like, okay, if you write your own material, like that, there's you can push things much further than people who don't, so yeah, so I think the red thread of it all, if you will, for me, yes, I'm fascinated by sound, but ultimately these are all people that wrote songs to a very successful degree, so I think songs, if you had to sort of boil it all down to one big thing, it's like the song is what has always grabbed me.
And obviously being a guitarist myself, and I mean, and you've got appreciation for rock, no doubt. But the just knowing Prince, like you said, obviously phenomenal. I mean, but the rock side, I mean, standing on the shoulders of Hendrix in many ways as well. And then you look at Funkadelic, Maggot Brain. I mean, Eddie Hazel and just
Eddie Hazel.
That's like Hendrix. This is Hendrix era stuff. Like he could have been like as big as that. You know what I mean?
He was. Listen, we got to talk about like, okay, so 10, we got to talk about Eddie Hazel, because not a lot of people know who Eddie Hazel is. It's not a surprise to me that you do, but Eddie Hazel to me on a guitar playing level is up there in the top 5 of all time. I would say Hendrix, of course. I would argue Santana. But Eddie Hazel and his use of phasers just in Funkadelic and of course died way too early. But man, that was an incredible guitar player. And it was really interesting, like how one of my favorite guitar players growing up as a teenager was Jimmy Hazel, who was in 24/7 Spies, which I don't know if you remember that group, but it's like a black metal group, kind of in the slipstream of Living Color. But he literally named himself Jimmy Hazel, first name Jimmy for Hendrix, last name Hazel for Eddie Hazel. I don't even really know what his actual name is, but he literally sort of took those two names. And I was really fascinated by guitar players for a long time, because of the friends that I had. Like I've always been kind of a keyboard player myself, but my friends were all guitar players, and they would introduce me again to Frank Zappa. Like my childhood friend, he was like, listen to this, listen to how Frank starts high and goes down. Like I had no idea. Like he was like, most guitar solos, they'll start low and they'll go up, but Frank will actually go down on the neck, you know. And I was like, holy shit. Like that was stuff that fascinated me as a kid, like the sheer technical proficiency of it, but then also just the musical content of it. So always been a massive Hendrix fan, massive Santana fan, massive Eddie Hazel fan, and those Funkadelic records, man, are incredible. And then to know that he was also versatile enough to contribute to Parliament, the more funky side. But then the Funkadelic records were just, they were going deep, like something like Standing on the Verge of Getting It On, like those solos, like, man, like there's nothing like it. So yeah, I know we're going all over the place, but Eddie Hazel needs to be mentioned as one of the top guitar players of all time. And he doesn't really get the credit that he deserves, largely because of him dying at a very young age. But incredible player, and the people that know, they know, like they know.
But he did leave a body of work. That's the thing. Like if you want to find out about him, it's there. Like his solo stuff, going from the psychedelic rock to all out funk. I mean,
yeah,
there's just this transition and groundbreaking stuff. I mean, do you know much about Shuggy Otis?
Oh yeah.
Strawberry Letter 23 and all that. Like it's, I mean, you know, influential stuff. That era, that whole psychedelic era, there was a lot of black guitarists doing a lot of really influential stuff. And then you look at Prince, and then like he's a result of all of that, and he just took it to a whole other level. And even look, Michael Jackson wasn't really a musician; he was a vocalist, but he had the mind of a musician. He created his own songs and instrumentation and everything in his mind, and just got the pros to really just play what was in his mind, but sort of thing. And but he was like a rock musician as well. I mean, he turned in the 80s to like a rock, Dirty Diana, and and like he got the best guitarist Slash, and then even Santana in the Invincible album with Whatever Happens, and like he always had he had the raspiness of, he turned rock. You know?
Yeah, he really did. And when he hired Jennifer Batten, it was like, like he really knew what he was doing. Like he still had the funky side to it, but yeah, he kind of went all the way in it. And I think Michael doesn't really get the credit because he's often seen as an entertainer, and of course he was the king of pop and whatever, and so dynamic as a singer dancer. But he was not. He was the master of his own destiny musically. Like he was very sophisticated. I recently watched a documentary about We Are the World. I think it was called The Night the music change or something, but the way that and there's a lot of footage of Michael recording his hooks, like "We Are the World," and just the professionalism and the drive and the way that he knew exactly how to nail. Like he knew when he nailed it, and he knew when he had to do it again. Michael was an incredible talent. And I think I often talk about Prince because Prince was kind of, the one-man band, and he played all the instruments, and Michael didn't as much, but I do rate them sort of equally, although very differently. Both had musical minds that I think were so far beyond their times, you know, and obviously both heavily influenced by James Brown, but taking very different, you know, taking it both in very different directions. Both great pop artists, but obviously Prince a little bit more off the beaten path, if you will. But yeah, Michael, I think, was a musician just as much as Prince was. He may not have played searing guitar solos, but he was a musician, absolutely. And Thriller was another album that had an incredible effect on me. I mean, you could not escape Thriller in 83, 84, right? Same as you couldn't escape Purple Rain. So you know, you heard all of these songs all the time. And again, at first you think, oh, it just sounds really good. Then you start figuring out, it's like, oh my God, like Wanna Be Starting Something. Like I still get goosebumps listening to that. You know, it's an incredible recording. So yeah, there's so much about that time that shaped me. That I really have such a passion for, that like I will never be able to stop talking about some of these people that I love and respect and appreciate, and what they meant for me as a musician myself.
And yeah, like, and just going, I know we're going way on a tangent, but I love this kind of conversation. But the thing with that's I believe is also underappreciated about Michael is the fact that a lot of people just think he's a pop star. He's just a singer and a
Yeah,
dancer. That's it. It's
yeah,
much more than that. If you go and look, you listen to his demos,
yeah.
it's all him. Basically, it's all his ideas. I mean, if you watch the Bad documentary and you look at Steve Stevens explaining how he wanted him to play the guitar part
Mhm.
exactly, note for note, just with the pause in the chorus, he said he wanted me to play that way because it had this the effect in his mind. It had a certain effect that he wanted to display in the song. So you know what I mean? Like, there's musicianship as well. So which can, in a lot of ways, I believe, go underappreciated. You know, he wasn't just a vocalist or a singer like back then, but also especially today in the pop scene. There's just vocalists and they don't write anything. So you know,
Right, right.
whereas they did everything. They did everything. George Michael, Billy Joel, you know, Elton John, all these guys. You know, like they did the whole lot. Phil Collins. I mean,
Phil
even
Collins. Yes,
these are
yes,
the
yeah.
goats.
It was, and I think they all took pride in you know, taking the craft as further as they can go. You know, writing, like I think there was a lot of competition in those days, but it was artistic competition, right? It was like, you know, one upping each other with these songs, right? Like and coming up with hits that still, again, we talked about that before, but still had a lot of content. Like Phil Collins was another one, where, you know, on the surface it all sounds amazing, but then you start realizing like incredible musicianship, incredible songwriting, you know. So I do think that you still had a lot of that in the 90s, but in the 80s, like, it was all about sort of packing as much content as you could in a 3 minute 45-second radio hit and trying to see what you could get away with, you know. And of course, like, that is some of the stuff that I think really shaped me.
Yeah, cool. So you're not just a beat maker because you sort of made your name from Connected and with your hip hop stuff. There's a musicality obviously with your music, and that's what I noticed with Connected straight away. I said this is different. This is very new soul, but I don't hear any samples. So, um, you're a trained musician, right?
To whatever degree, like so I studied, so when I came out of high school, I, like most people at that age, I had no clue what I wanted to do. And so I went to the University of Amsterdam and I studied musicology because it had the word music in it, and I figured that anything with music would be fun. Now, what I didn't realize is that was all theory and analysis, and there was not a practical side to it. So I quickly kind of became a little bit disenchanted with it. But I will say that I learned a lot there that at the time I really didn't see the purpose of, but now I kind of depend on every day, like harmony, melody, rhythm, so I'm classically trained. I took when I was a teenager, I actually took classical guitar lessons, like straight up nylon string. Like I had my start on the guitar. At some point, I switched to bass for the simple fact that all my friends were playing guitar. So if I wanted to play with them, like I had to pick up a bass, and that's essentially what I did. So I that was kind of the start of my kind of multi-instrument side, as you will. Um, I think the true passion I have for keyboard instruments, which I'm self-taught on keyboard, but I really, what I like about keyboard instruments is that it really is an entryway into a world of, especially synthesizers, right? A synthesizer can sound however you can make it sound. It can sound like a guitar, it can sound like an orchestra, it can sound like horns, it can sound like pianos, right? So when I started making my own tracks, I gravitated towards keyboards because it was a way for me to express myself without having to depend on a band, right? I could essentially do all the parts, kind of, how Prince did it. Certainly not a comparison, but I liked being able to express myself and not need anybody else to make the point, because I was making music in the days leading up to Connected. I was essentially making music to kind of deal with the boredom of the working life. Like I was working at a call center, an internet help desk, and it was just a kind of a monotonous job that when I came home at night, I just needed an outlet, So I started making beats, just really kind of out of to deal with working life. And the very first year that I made beats, I wouldn't even save them. I would just spend all night on the computer making beats, and then at the end of the night, I would just turn the computer off. I was like, that was fun. Just pure relaxation, I suppose. And at some point, I was like, man, I might need to start saving some of these, because I'm picking up a lot of like I was really, again, like sort of comparing to earlier, I was imitating my influences. I was imitating like stuff like Tribe Called Quest or De La Soul, or hip hop like that, Jay Dilla, The Roots. That was all stuff that I liked at the time, and I didn't know how those records were made. I really had no clue, so I had to kind of find out a lot of that stuff on my own. So every time I would reach a point where I discovered a technique that I thought was really close to what they would use, I was like, whoa, that's kind of around the time that I started actually saving them and mixing them down. And then, of course, Okayplayer kind of came into it a little bit down the ways. But at first, I didn't, I had some close friends, but I didn't really have a way to share them with the world at all. My close friends all liked the same music that I did, but I wasn't part of any particular scene. Certainly not the Dutch hip hop scene, because the Dutch hip hop scene at the time was was more abstract sounding. Everybody was rapping in Dutch, and I never really thought that was super appealing at the time. I was a little bit of a snob, kind of going back to, like, I was listening to American music, and I liked MCs that were sounding a certain type of way. Like, I really liked Q-Tip. I really liked Black Thought of the Roots. Like, that was what I wanted. I didn't fit in with kind of the local stuff. So Okayplayer was kind of my entry into literally kind of an American audience, that at first I was just interested in feedback. Like, I just wanted to know if what I was doing had any merit to people that knew the music that I loved. So like, Okayplayer sort of provided me a platform purely to get feedback. I never really intended to take it as far as I took it at the end of the day. I just wanted to know, what do people in America think of this stuff? Because I had sort of this image of, like, they know what they're talking about. A little simplified, but still, that was how I was looking at hip hop at the time. So when I put my music up on Okayplayer, I just wanted to know, like, does this suck or is this pretty good? Is there something here? And then the reactions were so positive, much more positive than I had imagined, that I was like, okay, like, so does this mean I should start making more of this stuff? Like, I really didn't have a concept of like doing it for a living, or I just needed an outlet at night from this job, right? So that's when people started saying like, wow, you're really, there's something here, this is really great. And then not too long after that, Phonte, my partner in the foreign exchange, he hit me up and he's like, yo, these beats are really great, what is your plans with them? And I told him, I was like, man, I just work at a help desk, I have no plans with any of these. And he was like, okay, what do you think if we do something with them? And that's literally how the train started rolling. I had no plans, and Phonte was like, look, if you just have all these beats, like, why don't we start recording something to them? So that's kind of how the ball initially started rolling.
I want to get back to that in a very quick second. I just want to just sort of go back to, okay, so you obviously had a love of hip hop, so that would have been in the 90s, right? So probably early 90s and all that. So because from what I remember, CD stores didn't sell vinyls. You had to go to an actual record store that sold vinyls. So you would have been going to these places to buy record, like the up-to-date hip hop stuff, right? And usually where you grew appreciation for it.
Yeah, yes and no. I mean, my exposure was actually largely through television. Like, because at some point in the Netherlands, like, you had we had a European version of MTV. It was largely based out of the UK. And at some point in the early 90s, they started broadcasting Yo MTV Reps, the American shows. And so that was primarily my window of exposure, was watching Yo MTV Reps. And if I remember correctly, they were on every day, um, at night at some point, and sometimes in the weekend even. So I would get these videos. Like, it was largely, music videos by whatever was hip hop at that point. Even the commercial stuff was quote unquote underground, right? So I had stuff from Ice Cube, I had stuff from Tribe Called Quest, J. Rue Demaja, Gangstar. Like, at that point, the stuff that was selling was what you would now consider to be underground. Even groups that were already legacy acts at that point, like a Run DMC, were doing stuff at that point that you would consider to be an underground kind of sound. So I heard all of that stuff firsthand through watching the television. And then, yeah, I would buy a lot of it. I really, again, I was a very eclectic listener. I loved rock music at the same time. I think there was a link there between rock and hip hop, that it had a punch. It packed a punch. There was a certain aggression to it that I think I gravitated towards. But yeah, my exposure was largely through television, and then later really getting into it and buying records. And yeah, like, a lot of that was vinyl, but we would trade cassettes a lot. Like, we would dub cassettes. Like, if something new came out, one of us had it, like, we would all dub it, and then I would have something and I would dub it. So we became very avid dubbers. Like we would exchange cassettes. And so a lot of those early hip hop records that I loved, like Low End Theory, the first Tribe Called Quest album, like, I heard that first on a cassette, and so, like, to today, I have an affinity for the sound of music coming from a cassette, like the sort of light saturation, the little bit of the hiss, and even today, I'll use mixing techniques to kind of emulate that, because that's sort of what triggers a lot of really great memories for me, is the fact that it was slightly degraded, yet sounded really good. And of course, the more you use a tape, the less good it sounds. But yeah, a lot of this was tapes for us too, especially around those times. Um, so my exposure was largely through Yo MTV Reps, like an American TV show.
Yeah, so I mean, I wasn't really listening to hip hop as much, but my uncle was a DJ, and like the early '90s, and he's actually similar to your age, but he's more like an older brother to me. But he used to make mixtapes and Public Enemy and Ice T and all these dudes, even Tribe as well, uh and he'd just show us all this stuff. And like, wow, and then finding out that funky drummer was used, like, from James Brown, like it's just like they used it as the break beats in a lot of those early hip hop songs. But yeah, so there's that hip hop influence. But what about Tribe in particular? So you're um very much influenced by Tribe and Dilla as well. What can you describe to me how much of an influence they had on you, and why?
I think at the like this is all stuff that I realized after the fact, of course. But what I really liked about Tribe in particular, and I think the Native Tongues group as a whole, so De La Soul, Black Sheep, Moni Love, like it was a I liked all hip hop at that time. I really liked what Ice Cube was doing. He had I think it was Death Certificate or The Predator was out. Like that was another album that I really loved. But what I loved about Tribe Called Quest was the jazz, their use of jazz, like, and especially Low End Theory was kind of a tribute to jazz in many ways. It had Ron Carter on some of these tracks, and I think even the title Low End Theory is a direct sort of play on the jazz influence. But I really hadn't ever I hadn't been exposed to jazz like that yet. Um, that wasn't something that my parents listened to or even my friends listened to. So a lot of my jazz exposure comes directly through hip hop samples, and particularly Tribe Called Quest made such amazing use of some of these jazz samples, that I started looking up what the originals were and then really appreciating the records themselves. So um, I think the sophistication of A Tribe Called Quest, the production and the vocals and the lyrics, and then the group interplay, between Q-Tip and Fife. I couldn't tell you exactly why, but that quickly became my favorite group. And then later, of course, when Dilla became one of their primary producers for, I think it was I want to say the album before the Love Movement. It's the one that people always talk shit about. It's the one that Consequence kind of became a part of the group. Beats, Rhymes, and Life. I think that was the one where people started sort of. I guess it was a move away from Midnight Marauders, which of course was hugely successful. But I really loved. I loved the elements that Dilla brought into the group, because he was sort of doing things that were kind of a new evolution of the stuff that I heard DJ Premier do, or Pete Rock do, or Q-Tip do, or any of these hip hop producers, even Dr. Dre. It felt like Jay Dilla was kind of grabbing all of that and then shaking it around and taking it to a completely new level in terms of the drum programming, in terms of the way that he would treat samples, in terms of the way that he would mix the records. So I think a lot of that was, for me, still checking a lot of these musical boxes, that even though it was hip hop and it was beat making, there was a musical element to it, that I gravitated towards as a fan of stuff like Prince and Parliament Funkadelic. It was like, this is the logical next step, right? So when I started making beats, I was like, okay, so you mean to tell me that that you can actually that you can make hip hop but have it have a musical basis versus a very you know, a more aggressive side to it. Like you can make hip hop that sounds pretty, that sounds appealing, again, accessible. You know, where the drums are still really, really hard hitting, but the layers in the background are sophisticated, are jazzy, are pretty. That is what made me really, really a big fan of A Tribe Called Quest, The Roots, certainly, Common, you know, like the Water for Chocolate record, Slum Village. The list goes on and on, but there was this whole slew of record that I think they all took hip hop into that space of like, it still has the sensibility of the street, quote unquote, but they were adding these influences, like they were adding Fela Kuti influences and jazz and soul and you name it. And it was like that kind of opened up a whole new world for me.
Mm. And Dilla obviously was savant. I mean, you'd have to say that nothing compares to the way. I mean, with my limited knowledge of hip hop compared to like maybe yourself and others, but from what I've researched and know, like it's just that his technique and his approach was just his library that he had of music was just, and he knew each record, he knew where everything went. He knew he had this library of um, beats and melodies and samples in his brain, and the way he chopped them up was just
Yeah.
so innovative in a way that no one had ever done before. And if you
Yeah.
listen to, like, in the same way that a musician would just dissect music, if you dissect the way that he mixed everything, it's just mind blowing,
Yeah.
groundbreaking stuff.
Yeah, I was never the same once I was introduced to Dilla, and I would urge anybody who would like to know more about him to read the book Dilla Time by my good friend Dan Charnas, which does a very, very great job of explaining why his work is so crucial, and I think and unique in the greater body of work that hip hop is. His use of the MPC, which the MPC, for those who don't know, was a machine that was invented by Roger Lynn, who is also the inventor of the Lynn drum, which was the drum machine that Prince used to great effect. And Roger Lynn has gone on record to say that Dilla was using the MPC in ways that Roger Lynn himself hadn't even remotely considered, particularly when it came to timing, like a lot of polyrhythm. So, you know, there's kick drums that are a particular way, there's hi-hats and snares, and none of them line up in a way that a traditional grid would tell you to do. Yeah, I think a savant is probably a good way to describe it. I think he just was literally kind of a Mozart of the hip hop genre, if there's such a thing. I know it sounds a little rudimentary, but I do think that everything that hip hop was from the late 70s to the early 90s sort of came together, and he sort of saw that, understood it, and took it to a next level. And that's a rarity in music. And now he is getting appreciated even by people outside of hip hop, you know, by people in soul and in jazz. And there's a lot of jazz, like Robert Glasper, who's an amazing jazz pianist. He will talk about Dilla for hours. So he kind of was able, by way of being a sheer genius, was sort of able to transcend hip hop, and is now kind of considered one of the geniuses of his time. And of course, another person who died way too young, because he was kind of when he died, he was kind of on the verge of becoming a producer that would have worked with the Justin Timberlakes of the world, or, you know, he was kind of getting into the pop lane. He was being sought out by people that were making kind of pop records, and it would have been really, really interesting to see how he would have sort of changed even, I think, pop music, because he was yeah. And I think for me, from 2000 to like 2006, when he passed away, Like I was a stan, as the kids would say nowadays. I was taking every ounce of what Dilla was doing, analyzing it, trying to emulate it at times, at first, and then trying to find my own a way of letting that influence sort of inform my own voice. But certainly at first, just trying to sheer emulate what he was doing.
So were you sampling at that time yourself?
I wasn't initially, because I had so I never had an MPC. I never had the traditional equipment that you would use to make hip hop records. I just had a computer. So at first I didn't even really know how you would do that. Then later I would find out, like, okay, I could connect my turntable to a computer and I can record it. So one of my first beats that I did was a beat called Light It Up that I did around late 2001. And I took a little bit of Al Green. I took a little bit of Let's Stay Together by Al Green, that sort of distinct, and I remember thinking, like, okay, I have this in the computer now. I can cut this up into smaller pieces and then kind of rearrange it in a way that it's still Al Green, but it's also me. But when I listen to it now, it's a very rudimentary way of sampling. I just took two little horn stabs and just kind of started triggering them. But it was a lot of fun. And then I think I started getting more sophisticated. The Connected record, ironically, does have a lot of samples, but I did it in a way where I put a lot of instruments in front of it. So it wasn't readily apparent that a lot of the meat and bones of Connected is actually sample-based music. But I would add my own keyboards, I would add my own bass lines, I would add all these things, and then I would cut the samples up in ways that I wasn't using straight loops. I would take a little bit from here and a little bit from there and rearrange it. So for instance, Nick's Groove, which was another really early record on Connected, was actually based on a Singers Unlimited sample, the vocal group from the 60s and 70s. But then you would never know it because I slowed it down, I think 8 steps. So it's pitched way low. I'm taking a little bit from the outro of the record. I'm taking a little bit from the middle. So at some point it became a point of pride, which I had learned from studying people like Premier and Pete Rock, and certainly Dilla. It's kind of almost a point of pride that you would obscure your samples in a way that people wouldn't find out what it was. So even to this day, there's some samples on Connected that when I play them for people, they're like, wait, what just happened? Because it wasn't readily apparent. I did use some loops, but more so I would do what they call chopping the sample, which is you just take little bits of it, kind of shake it all up and relay it out in your own order and create something new out of it. But I was sampling a lot from, let's say, 2002 to about 2008, which is when I sort of realized that samples are kind of a legal sort of gray area. There's a morality question there that ultimately, for me, prompted me to want to do my own compositions, like free of anyone else's music. I always felt a little bit conflicted about sampling. There's nothing like a well-chosen sample, and it's hard to emulate a good sample. But because of the fact that it never is truly 100% yours, I ultimately ended up moving away from sampling as a whole.
Yeah, so interesting to see how you really took elements from what Dilla, or DJ Premier would, produce their stuff. You did yours with actual live instrumentation from you. So innovative. I mean, and maybe in a sense, Prince as well and Stevie Wonder, like their experimentation, and always pushing the boundaries with their technology that they had at their whim at the times.
Yeah.
So is this the kind of stuff that you was that? So Okayplayer. This is probably what, early 2000s, what, 2000, 2001, maybe.
Yeah,
You're on
literally.
Okayplayer. You come into contact with Phonte.
Yeah.
Well, even before that, what were these the kinds of beats that you were sending on Okayplayer at the time? Like these masked sampled kind of beats and that the responses were like pretty positive as well, right?
Yeah, literally. So the first, so I became a member of Okayplayer. Uh,
Can you just give can you give us a tiny breakdown, just for the ones that don't know what Okayplayer is, just what it
yes.
is?
So I in for me it started with Voodoo by D'Angelo that came out early 2000, and I loved that record so much that I listened to nothing else for like months. And somewhere in the booklet for Voodoo it said okayplayer.com. And I didn't know what it was, but I was curious enough to want to find out. So at some point, I just typed it in, okayplayer.com, and it led me to this website that was primarily run by Questlove, the drummer for The Roots. And that was kind of really a portal into the music of like-minded artists. So you had Common on there, D'Angelo, I think Talib Kweli, a group called the Jazzy Fat Nasties at the time, were like an R&B duo, um, and that was kind of the front layer of the website. But in the back was a message board, and this was pre-social media. So for the people that don't know, a message board was kind of a more linear version of people talking to each other about topics. In this case, it was music. But it was, kind of like not unlike Facebook, I suppose, today. But there were these different topics that you could leave your replies to. And at some point found that back area of the website and got really intrigued and like, okay, people are talking about the music that I love. Like people are talking about new hip hop releases, but they're also talking about Radiohead, for instance, or any kind of stuff. And so Phonte was somebody who I started seeing in a lot of these different topics where I was like, hey, we are obviously interested in the same stuff because I keep seeing this name, Phonte. Like, and my desire to get feedback prompted me to post 2 beats. This was early 2002. I posted a beat called, well, I didn't have a name for it. It was untitled at the time, but it was what ended up being Be All Right from Connected. That was the very first beat that I ever posted on Okayplayer, because at that point, I sort of had gotten a feel for the place. I was like, okay, there's a lot of people that are talking about music. And I just wanted to know where I stood, and this was the perfect place to do it. So one day I just posted a beat to the message board, and that was what later became Be All Right. And Light It Up was the second track that I posted there. And literally, Phonte reached out to me via a direct message. He was like, "Look, I really like these beats. What are you doing with them?" And as we discussed before, I wasn't doing anything with them. Um, so it quit, and I had just found out and heard a couple of tracks from a group that he was in called Little Brother. And Little Brother to me was very much like the next step, the next evolution of De La Soul, of Tribe Called Quest. It was kind of the same but new. It was young, but it was old. It was kind of, and I really liked, I had heard like 2 or 3 tracks from Little Brother at that time. So I was like, hell yeah. Like, of course you can do whatever we want with these tracks, because I knew I didn't have that sort of I didn't have those artists around where I was at the time in the Netherlands. So in a weird way, there was an immediate trust there between the two of us. We had never met face to face. We were just kind of behind avatars, both of us, you know what I mean? On the internet. But for some reason that we've talked about a lot over the years, there was an immediate trust there. And I think it was a recognition of a musical affinity, that maybe didn't need words or a lot of explanation of like, oh, how is this going to work? We both had crappy internet connections. I just had a cable internet at the time at the house, but Phonte didn't even have his own computer at first. He had to go to the computer lab at school. Um, and there was a time difference also of kind of similar to how we're talking now. He was 6 hours behind me. So at first it was even kind of a challenge to even get up with each other, but somehow it all worked. And at some point he hit me up and he was like, we've recorded 2 tracks. We've recorded 2 songs and I need to get them to you. And figured out like, okay, like we can jump on something called AOL Instant Messenger, which at the time was just how we used to communicate towards each other. And he sent me 2 MP3s in February of 2002. He had 2 songs completed. And when I heard those songs, like I fell out flat. It was like a moment of hearing everything that you would want to do musically, hearing that back and realizing like, wait, like what just happened? Like, how is this exactly, like this is exactly like all these groups that I love, but it's us now making it. An experience that I couldn't explain to you truly in words what it meant for me at the time, but a revelation in all ways, like a complete, like a revelation, certainly a spiritual experience, a moment where you realize that nothing will ever be the same ever again. And it was just 2 songs. And long story short, man, we stayed doing it that way for 2 years. Never with the goal of like, oh, this is going to be an album or we're going to release this. Just purely passion for music. And the irony is that we still have that hunger to this day, you know. So, but yeah, there was an immediate trust there. It was really crazy. I can't explain it, but it was there from the start.
I just have to think. Okay, now we know about how prevalent scammers are and theft of intellectual property and all this. This is in the primitive days of the internet, right? The early 2000s we're talking about here. So
yeah,
what was it? You're communicating through avatars. It could have been anyone that said, "Oh, hey, I'm Phonte from Little Brother." I mean, it could have been anybody. But was it? I'm just thinking now. Was it when he actually sent you his vocals or his recordings, with your music? Was that when you said, "Okay, this is legit now. This is actually the guy"?
Yeah, it I don't think we even like, it's weird, but you have to really go back to, like you said, the earliest days of the internet, where it was honestly more about the potential than it was ever about the negative sides of it. Like I don't think that came until much later. So it was purely just like the internet is this amazing place where you can come across people from different worlds. And of course, for me, it kind of was a window into America in a lot of ways. So there was never that feeling of like, is this really him or is this really? And of course, you have to imagine he was at the beginning of his career, the same as I was of mine. So he was just Phonte. He was just a guy who had just recently graduated college and who was starting making music with his friends. And so the thought that it might not be him was never really truly relevant. It was like it was an idealistic time, and he liked what I was doing, and I liked what he was doing, and that was enough. And of course, nowadays everybody makes records that, or a lot of people make records that way, but it's fraught with the potential of like you said, like it could go horribly wrong. Of course, at the time, it seemed like it was kind of a sort of a brave new world, but in the positive sense of the word. And we just trusted each other, and probably in a very naive and green way. you know, as only you can do when you're in your early 20s and you just don't have anything to lose per se. I didn't have anything to lose. Um, Looking back, yeah, now with the knowledge of now, you're sending people your intellectual property, your babies, if you will, you know, your children. Um, but especially once I heard those true tracks come back, I was like, wait, so this means like this means everything. Like we can do this. We don't have to be in a studio together. We don't even have to really know each other. We didn't know anything about the other person. Like I had no idea who he was, like on a human level. Um, he certainly didn't know much about me. I was from overseas, from a country that he had never gone to. So, like for all intents and purposes, we knew nothing about the other than one simple thing, and that was like we like how this sounds. I like what he's doing. He likes what I'm doing. And when I say that music is a universal language, that's kind of what they mean when you say that. Like it sounds real kind of fluffy and floaty, but that was truly what bound us together. Was And of course later I found out that Phonte is a very discerning, serious music student, a scholar of music, same as I am. He's got a very eclectic, well-formed taste. So looking back, maybe it was part serendipity. Maybe it was meant to be this kind of way. I certainly believe that at this point that it was probably too much of a coincidence to be a coincidence. Um, but yeah, it was a beautiful thing, and also something that you look back and you realize like what the hell, how did that even all work out? But we trusted each other. We never had one moment where either one of us had a trepidation or like a feeling of like, hey, should we even be doing this? Like not once did we even ever have a conversation about any of these things. It was just like, oh, you're making tracks, I would like to do some vocals on them. And it just kept, that ball just kept rolling and rolling and rolling for pretty much 2 years straight until we had so much music that we were just like, wait, is this an album? Is this a group? What is happening here? You know, we had never really put names on this stuff at first. It was just like, okay, you make music, I do vocals. But at some point we started realizing like we have like 10, 12 songs here. Like, what is this? What are we doing? And then it became a group that at some point got a name, the Foreign Exchange, which was actually thought up by Big Pooh of Little Brother, who said like, hey, this is like, you know, Foreign Exchange. It made sense, right? And then we started heavily leaning into that and calling the album Connected, which of course also was symbolic to how we met. So it within the span of 2 years, we went from not having a clue of what we were doing to realizing like we've got something here. We may need to think about releasing this, even though we didn't know necessarily how. But this is a concept album almost of somebody on this side of the ocean and somebody else on the ocean coming together and making something with a lot of chemistry that even we didn't really know where the chemistry came from.
So yeah, so Little Brother, well, their first album came out early 2000s, wasn't it? 2002, wasn't it?
Yeah, 2002. Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
So they've already got their own thing happening, and then here you overseas on the side. Obviously, Phonte, like from what you said with Big Pooh, like he's used obviously they were in the loop about what was happening with you guys.
Yeah.
So I mean, what was the dynamic there? Because I mean, they made quite a name for themselves, you know, in time as well. But you also had this little thing going with the Foreign Exchange. So what was that dynamic like from your understanding? I mean, I know you were overseas at the time, but
right.
Yeah.
No, well, this is how I understand it, and even because at this point it's 20 years old, we've recently talked about it. But The Little Brother album came out. The Listening came out. I think it was the end of 2002. At that point, Phonte and I had already done a few tracks together, and really it was Little Brother and I, because the earliest tracks it was all Phonte and Big Pooh, and the earliest discussions that we had were like, let's do an EP together. Let's do Nicolay versus Little Brother. Like at the earliest stages, Little Brother was starting to create some buzz, of course, and so it made sense that at first it would be something like, okay, Little Brother versus Nicolay. The irony is that Big Pooh at some point was like, this really is not for me. He very honest, and to this day I credit him for that. He was like, look, I like this shit, it's really dope, but this is not really, like, I am more trying to do something that is more kind of hard hitting boom bap. Like, so at some point the decision was made, like, okay, we've done the listening, maybe it's time for all of us to now do a solo thing, quote unquote. So Big Pooh started working on an album called Sleepers. I think it came out in '05. And so it made sense for Phonte and I to split off and do our own thing. So from that moment on, which Big Pooh, again, luckily before he left the project, gave us our name. But yeah, he wanted to go in a different direction. And so at that point, it became clear, like, okay, so Phonte and I are doing this thing, and Big Pooh is doing his own thing. And in essence, they were both kind of solo projects of the two rappers in Little Brother. And Ninth Wonder, the producer, at that point was gaining foothold with, like, he was doing a lot of production at that point for people, including like Jay-Z at some point, right? So already their paths were diverging after that first album. And so Phonte and I kind of looked at the Foreign Exchange at first as kind of a side project. And when it was released, it was partly a solo album for him, but more so kind of a side project, because he wasn't on every single track. He was on most of them, but he was kind of the conductor, if you will. He put all of the vocal personnel in place. We were very influenced by an album, by a project called Uncle, which was DJ Shadow, and the name escapes me, but he had a partner who was in a similar way, kind of brought all these people together, including people like the lead singer for Radiohead, Tom York. So again, like all the music was by me, and Phonte kind of brought this whole cast of characters together. So that was kind of the dynamic of it. It was a side project because it was understood that Little Brother was the main event. They were in themselves becoming successful, and Foreign Exchange was a side project of Phonte and myself. So if you look at the album, the Connected album, it's kind of being presented as Phonte of Little Brother and Nicolay, and as such, we were a duo, but of course we were being assisted by this cast of characters. Of course, Big Pooh was on a lot of the tracks. Yazra was on a couple of tracks. Darian Brockington, it was kind of his introduction into the world. So, it was a duo album, but it was also a group album, but it was also a solo album. It was very fluid, I think. And I don't think even we knew exactly what it was. We just knew that we really liked what we had done. And so at some point it became a question of, like, how are we going to put this into the world? And that's when BBE, the label that released Connected, kind of came into the picture. And we ultimately ended up signing a deal for release of it.
Mm. Yeah, that's what a story. And like this, I've got, so you might be interested in this. So my experience with your music, right? So we're talking about 2005. So I met my buddy Ben and his brother. Um, he's a hip hop DJ, right? And so he had and he was my introduction to more. I knew it all existed. Never really listened to it because I'm more the guitar side. So Badu, Maxwell, D'Angelo, all that. He had all the roots and Common and all this stuff. But he had your album here, your solo album, and Connected as well. I
Wow. Nice.
heard someone Connected because I used to like go on massive searches through iTunes and looking for new stuff. But I came across your stuff. But he actually had the actual vinyl, and we used to listen to it. And I used to think, hey, this is different. This is different. It sounds real. Like now, you tell me now, like there's a lot of samples in there that were masked, but I mean, in a masterful way, I'd have to say, and in a convincing way. But it was just and you know, and that influenced us. So I'd make the music, would make our own songs, and my buddy's brother, he'd rap over it. He was pretty talented. But there was something, and I was hooked to your sound from there, you know. And we're talking. This is Australia, so
Yeah, and that's interesting because we randomly had distribution there. Because I remember even in the earliest days doing a few phone interviews with Australian press. In the Mix was one. So we had somehow our music was out there in Australia, and I found that to be very fascinating because I never really thought too much about what would happen after it was released. Like we had done our thing and I was really happy with it. And then to get feedback from countries like Australia for us literally on the other side of the planet was like mind blowing, you know, and to know that you could get our records there. Granted, it might have been difficult, but they were out there. So we did some interviews in Australia even, which is really interesting looking back because now your shit can be on Spotify and anybody ever in the world can dial it up. At the time, you needed distribution, like you needed a local company in Australia to be like, okay, send me some of these records and we'll put them in stores. And that is literally what happened. So it's amazing even to talk with you today because like at the time that was difficult to achieve for musicians who were starting out. You know what I mean?
absolutely. It's totally different ball game back then. You know, it was still the old school, all the distribution of stuff. Now, obviously, social media, you can take things into your own hands more these days as an artist, managing your own career and all that stuff. But yeah, that's what I'm saying. So that was my story, an introduction into your music. So listening to that, and I'm sort of having a mind blank. Was your instrumentals for that album also released at the same time?
Yeah.
Or was it? Yeah, I'm pretty sure he had that as well. So I would
Yeah.
listen to that and I'll be like, just on its own, I'm like, man, it's just like the musicianship, you know, like it just blew my mind, and because it was the best of also what I've been hearing with you know Badu's stuff and anything Raphael Sadiq produced, you know, and all that kind of stuff was
Wow.
just and what he was releasing at that time as well, his solo albums and stuff was so influential. Now, when with D'Angelo and all that stuff that he produced, so to me it aligned with that, and it was just this whole movement at the time, which it was very influential for me, that's for sure. But that's I put it among that. But it was funny because this was your first album, and I was like, that's what blew my mind away. And I didn't know like anything about Nicolay. Like no one knew about Nicolay.
Yeah.
I mean, and that you were even a like musician, and I just didn't know enough until Leave It All Behind.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
Now, look, that to me, your second album, you and Phonte, The Foreign Exchange, that blew my mind. That to me, that's a modern masterpiece. I'll just say, like, just
Oh,
something to say. From a
thank you.
musician perspective,
Yeah.
it was so different. It had rock, it had just like new soul elements, R&B, bossa nova,
Yep.
jazz. Like it was like everything that I loved was in this album, and it was just, I mean, like it was
Yeah.
progressive elements as well. It was
Yep.
just nuts. And I said, how can you go from Connected and then it's all like vocals and I didn't know Little Brother enough to know that Phonte was already singing with their stuff as well. I wasn't educated enough on that. But to me, I said, all of a sudden this guy's singing and he's got an amazing voice, which he already had, but that's just from my perspective. And I was like, it was a mind blowing
Wow.
moment for me. 2008. So, and that's when you
Yeah.
released it. And from that, I was hooked on everything you guys released. Full respect. I said, this Nicolay guy is he's a musician. He's an actual musician. And so, can you tell me, please, about the deciding factor between coming from hip hop and then making the transition to what became Leave It All Behind?
Yeah. And thank you so much. That is awesome to hear. Yeah. Well, I think we talked earlier about influences and how you at some point find your own voice. When Connected came out and it was really successful, I was really, really proud of it, but I also felt it kind of put me in a little bit of a box, quite honestly, because I grew up loving a lot of different music, as we just discussed, and Connected was relatively straightforward hip hop, although there were a number of songs on there that, if you look at it now, were kind of heralding, like a Come Around or like a Sincere, sort of already kind of a precursor of what Leave It All Behind ended up being. But long story short, I felt like, okay, hip hop has got to be this thing where you have a certain tempo and you choose certain sounds and it's all relatively square on the nose. And I really wanted to let more influences in. And at the same time, as I discussed earlier with you, I'd kind of gotten a little bit disenchanted with sampling. And I really wanted to create music that could get sampled more than anything, versus wanting to sample. I was like, if all of us sample, who are the next generation going to sample? Kind of a rudimentary statement, but that's how I felt at the time. So I was really interested in broadening our sound up, to not just think like, okay, I need to have a sample, I need to have a kick and a snare, and it's got to be 90 BPMs, and I wanted to do other things. So one of the first tracks I did was a track called If This Is Love, which was almost like a drum and bass kind of track, really fast drums with like ambient sort of pads. Another track that I did was House of Cards, which is actually an odd meter. I think it's a 5/8 or a 7/8. And it had a little bit of a Coldplay influence to it. Another track I did, which was Leave It All Behind, had a bossa feel to it. So I was really just kind of having fun, like sort of painting outside of the lines a little bit. And now, to be honest with you, we never had a conversation like, okay, this is an album where you're going to do singing. Like we never talked about it, not once. It was just the music that I started sending Phonte prompted him to say like, okay, this is not really something that I would rap over. Even like a track like Daykeeper, which you could potentially rap over. In fact, Kendrick Lamar used it for a mixtape that he did, like a really early mixtape, and he rapped over it, and it sounded cool. But Phonte just felt that the music that I was sending him, it prompted him to go in a different direction. Now, at first, the idea was that we were just going to be like a kind of like a Jam and Lewis, and we would cut all these songs on other artists. Like we talked about like a Jill Scott or an Erykah Badu or like any of these people, but we never kind of found the connection, quote unquote, pun intended, with artists like that. So at some point, Phonte was like, man, I think I'm gonna just have to do this shit myself, right? Like literally, like, okay, if we can't get these songs shopped around, quote unquote, I may have to just do it myself. So we never had that conversation of like, okay, we're gonna make an album now where it's all singing and we're gonna experiment and stuff. It kind of happened in a natural way. Um, and it was at the time that it came out, it led to a lot of debate because Phonte, of course, is one of the best rappers of his generation. And so a lot of people were like, wait, what is going on? This is not, this is not rapping Phonte. At the same time, he was still doing Little Brother, so it wasn't like he ever stopped rapping at all. He just felt that the music that I was sending him prompted a different side out of him. So when we looked up, like we started working on the album in 2006, 2 years after Connected was out. And when we were done, we were like, okay, so this album has like 2 rap verses, and this album is kind of all over the place. It's got a little bit of hip hop, it's got a little R&B, it's got a little bit of house, it's got a little bit of everything. Um, we don't really know what this is either, but it sounded good to us. We had a lot of fun making it.
And
And
2006, you moved to the US, right?
yes, so this was I moved to the US in '06 because Connected became really successful. Connected was released by BBE Records, a label that was founded in England, in the UK, but we were released on the American side of the label. And their dream was that after Connected, we would all release solo albums, like Phonte, me, Darian Brockington, Yazara. Now, what ended up, the only thing that ended up happening, that coming through of that dream, was that I stayed on BBE. I was the only one out of everybody that actually did end up signing that solo deal with BBE. So I released a record called Here in 2006, which was my first kind of proper solo record on BBE. And BBE offered to sponsor me for a visa to come to the United States, because at that point it was clear, like, okay, I'm having some success in America. We were successful in Europe too, but in America it was really, really happening. And like I told you at the beginning of our conversation, America was kind of the promised land for me in terms of music. So when it came up, like, hey, do you want to come here and further your career? I was like, absolutely. And so BBE sponsored me for a visa. Initially, it was like a 3-year period. So I came to the States in May of '06. And that was also roughly the time that we started work on the second album. Now, mind you, at that point, I was 2 hours away from Phonte, not 3,000 miles, but we still worked the same way. We still worked over the internet. We each had our own little space. I would send him music and he would send me vocals back, because at that point we had grown so accustomed to not being in the same room that we were like, we can't jinx this. Like, we can't change this. This is a winning team. There's no point for us to now go into a studio together. Like, we need to just keep doing this. So at the end of '06, we started working on Leave It All Behind for real. And as always with things regarding the foreign exchange, we never talked about anything. I remember at some point, Daykeeper was one of the first songs that I got back from Phonte, and I was like, okay, this is covering new ground for us. Like, this is psychedelic, dark, a little cold here and there, but at the same time warm. This is lyrically going into a completely new space for us. And I was so proud of it that I just kept rewinding it over and over. And every time that last vocal chord hit, I would just shout. I would just shout with pure elation, because I was like, we're doing something really, really new here. But at the same time, we had like Take Off the Blues, which was more straightforward, but great. But
I,
that was
I
kind of more the connected side of
I
Leave It
just
All Behind.
have to say, Take Off the Blues. If Spotify Unwrapped was available back then, that would have been number one of most listened songs 2 years straight for me. Because
Wow.
I get through phases like obviously we spoke about Human Nature, Michael Jackson,
Yeah.
Toto, and all that. I went for a long time like just researching all the different versions and all this. I loved it so much. Then I mean, fast forward, there's a lot of other songs, but then Badu's Back in the Day.
Oh
Oh,
yeah.
I mean, that
Yeah.
keyboard run,
Yeah.
it's bluesy, it's jazzy, it's funky, it's everything.
Yeah.
That would have been on my Unwrapped. But then after that, directly after that was Take Off the Blues from.
Nice. Yeah.
And that's what
Yeah.
I'm
I love Take Off the Blues because that was another. The beat was relatively straightforward, but then we had a trumpet player. Like we were kind of, again, we were just getting in, growing into our own selves as writers, as producers, as arrangers. We just wanted to have fun. So we got a trumpet player. We had a trumpet solo. Darian and Phonte sound amazing on that record. They go back and forth. We were just having fun, man. But we never discussed it. Like, okay, let's do this. We just were doing it. And then at the end of the day, we were like, okay, we got this album, and Phonte called it Leave It All Behind. Like he came up with that concept, and it was partly inspired by the fact that I left my home country, so it was kind of his perspective of my experience, and again, we never really had a lot of conversations about it, but this is how we ended up getting to know each other, was through our music and through our experiences and then our own perspectives of it. So even when he chose the cover image, which is it's a black and white cover, and it's right before actually my first wedding. It's from my own wedding, which the marriage didn't last, but the album is eternal, as they say. But it's a shot from right before with just. It could also be a funeral. You don't really quite know what is this. You see the chairs and it's black and white. And at some point we decided like, okay, everything about this album is going to be black and white. So the discs, one is black, one is white. One has the vocal versions, one has the instrumentals. Um, the the publicity photos that we took were black and white. We really wanted to make the point that this was something different, connected, very colorful. The cover, like the sun, it was all very colorful. For Leave It All Behind, everything was black and white because we really wanted to make the point that we're going into a different direction, and we talked a lot about albums growing up as kids, right? Earlier in the conversation. And at that point, we were just having fun with even the covers, with the booklet. Like we were just sort of just doing whatever we wanted to do that seemed like that reminded us of the albums that we loved growing up, So we were like, okay, what if we write our own liner notes? What if we handwrite the liner notes in the booklet? You know what I mean? What if we pick all these photos, like we pick the photos ourselves? We were just having a lot of fun with it. And then like it became even more successful than Connected, even like, which we thought like, okay, this is a risky business. Like this can either be really, really good, or these people are like, no, we want Connected for an exchange. Like this trash, this sucks. Of course, we believed in it, but the audience is always right, and you don't know what happens until you put it in front of people. But ultimately, the album was very, very successful. There were a few people that like would have preferred Phonte to rap, but I think as a whole, people understood what we were doing. You clearly did, and a lot of people like you did, where it was like, okay, they understood that we were growing, they understood that we were aging, that we were growing into ourselves as songwriters, as producers, as arrangers. And again, we were just having fun with it. So it was a really pivotal album for us, because I think that showed us like, okay, like we can truly be ourselves here, and we can be successful. Like, I think Connected was still, we're very much in the tradition of everything that came before us, and to whatever degree we were emulating groups like Tribe Called Quest and stuff. Leave It All Behind was us finding our own voice. It was
and
us.
and conforming really to anything. And
Right, right.
obviously, what's happened thereafter is just a result of that, because you guys have expanded so much ground and territory with your sounds.